Hey guys, another video for our How to Do Stuff in Japan playlist and our mini-series on being married to a Japanese person. Today's topic is language. Obviously, the topics we've discussed already are can be sometimes difficult, so here's another one that's just going to add into the mix to make it that much more complicated. So, of course, if a foreigner is going to be married to a Japanese person, there needs to be a common language that you can use. So usually what we see is foreigners usually end up with Japanese people who can speak English reasonably well, or their language reasonably well. We know a German guy who has a Japanese wife who can speak German. It does tend to be like that. So, but not always. Not always. In our case, it's not the case. In our house, the language is Japanese. So, but of course, you need a common language. And naturally, at first, when you first meet each other, if you've just first come to Japan and you've only been here a little while, or your Japanese isn't very good, and their English isn't very good, and so you sort of have basic communication. And at first, as two people that have just met and that are just sort of dating and just sort of spending some time together, doesn't matter because the topics are normally fairly light and it's normally a bit of fun. You know, maybe one of you's got a dictionary and now and again you get a word you don't know and you look it up in a dictionary and you can sit there and it's all very fun and just sort of makes it something a little bit exotic and interesting, you know, when you're trying to navigate through the communication thing. However, obviously, as the relationship goes on and sometimes important topics come up that need to be discussed, and at those times, of course, if you don't have a common language that you can both speak reasonably well, it can add another level of difficulty to what you're trying to do, to having the relationship, you know. So it can be really difficult. So of course, it's going to increase your chances of the relationship surviving. I mean, it's fairly standard anywhere in the world, isn't it? If you're going to have a relationship with someone, that good communication is important, and obviously trying to achieve good communication without a common language that you can both speak well is going to be really difficult. And topics come up, even if you've studied Japanese for a long time and your Japanese is pretty good, there's bound to be topics that come up that are about things that you haven't discussed before, and that's usually where you find that you need words that you don't know. And that's often the case. That's generally living in Japan, that's often the case as well. You know, you think your Japanese is pretty good, and then you go and sit down in the dentist's chair, and the dentist starts to describe what he's going to do to you. And of course, he's using a whole bunch of dental terms that you might never have heard before. You know, or you go and sit down at the accountant's office and he starts to give you a whole heap of information about your tax situation or about some government procedural thing, and then you find out that, you know, you don't know any of these accounting terms. And it's sort of the same in the relationship, is that you tend to, when topics come up that you want to discuss, it seems of all the topics we've talked about, the cheating one and the loyalty one, cheating topic, was the one that seems to have got the most response from people. Some people have got really, I couldn't deal with that. And if a topic like that does come up, I mean, probably you're better off not talking about that particular one, but if it comes up and you want to talk about it, there's going to be a whole heap of words that are going to come up in that conversation that you might not have used before in Japanese. So again, the focus of this video is the same as all the other videos. Some people have commented, what about them? What are they doing? And we did make a comment about a video about the Japanese point of view on this, but the way we see all the how-to videos, it's really about what we can do, isn't it? And again, same as relationships anywhere in the world. What they should do, or, you know, what the other person should do, or the other person, you know, shouldn't do, or whatever, is not really relevant, is it? When it comes to relationships, it's what we can do. You know, we have no control over what another person does, so we can only control what we do, and that's why the focus of these how-to videos tends to be on what we can do. So it's the same as with these relationship ones. If you're a foreigner and you're in a relationship with a Japanese person, well, you know, we're sort of focusing on what we can do and what we need to be aware of, you know. And a lot of these videos don't necessarily provide you with an answer. Well, at least what we're trying to do is at least provide you with some observations, so if nothing else, you won't be surprised. You know, and the comments that we're getting, if you look through the comments of these videos, you will see comments from people who've been in relationships with Japanese people who say, oh yeah, that's definitely true, I recognise that one, I wish I'd known that one before, and things like that. And that's sort of why we're making these videos, is that at least if you're aware of these things before they come up, it does make it easier to deal with things when you recognise them. When you have no idea it's coming and one of these things comes, it makes it that much more difficult to deal with. So the first thing you're going to have is the language thing. You're going to have to be able to communicate with each other about all sorts of important topics, and particularly if you're getting married, and that's what this video is about, is about being married to a Japanese person. I mean, if you're just in a relationship that's only sort of so deep and eventually you go back to your own country and it's all over, well, it didn't really matter, did it, you know? But once you start to get really serious, and then, you know, you've got a commitment to each other long term, and you're trying to have a sort of a serious relationship, in most cases in Japan, people won't live together until they're married. Not always the case, but most cases people prefer not to live together until they're married, because it's just sort of a bit of a stigma still about that. Again, not always the case. It wasn't the case in our case, but it is often the case. And then once you start living together, of course, or married, then obviously a lot of serious topics come up that need to be talked about, and your communication is going to be important. And there's a few other complications as well. It can really mess with the dynamic of your relationship. So, for example, if you, in your own country, if you're in a relationship, if you were married to somebody, you'd be able to do all your things, you know, your banking and your accounting and going to the dentist and the doctor, and, you know, reading all your mail and doing all your own stuff, and you'd be independent, wouldn't you? You know, and the way that makes you feel about yourself and your relationship, and how that makes your partner feel about you, and just how that might be important to the dynamic of some people's relationships, to be able to be sort of within your relationship, sort of independent in the way that you can conduct all your own affairs, you know, is sort of considered to be important by a lot of people, isn't it? So you can look after all your own stuff. And of course, if you're a foreigner and you come to Japan, you know, depending on your Japanese level, you might need to lean on your partner, and this is what tends to happen a bit, is that the foreigner tends to lean on the Japanese partner a fair bit for communication. So, and that can be, if your Japanese level is low, that could be an everyday thing. Every time the phone rings, oh, I can't answer the phone. And I'm actually thinking of somebody when I say this. I know someone who's lived in Japan for more than 10 years, but has always been surrounded by English-speaking people, and has never really improved their Japanese level. And as a result, he's really heavily reliant on his partner. And when we're at his house, if the phone rings, even if it's right beside him, he doesn't answer it. He answers his own cell phone, but if the house phone rings, he doesn't answer it, because his Japanese level isn't good enough to answer the phone. And if someone comes to the door, he sort of calls out to his wife, and she has to go and talk to the person at the door, and they've got a couple of kids, and when they go to meetings at the school, the wife has to do all the talking because he can't carry on a conversation with the teachers. And you know, and that's, you can imagine how that can affect the dynamic of the relationship. You know, that they're not really in their day-to-day life, you know, they can both end up feeling that they're not equal, can't they? I mean, whether they are or not is irrelevant, right? It's how people feel in relationships and how they perceive the relationship that's important, right? What the reality is sort of secondary in a way, isn't it? So, but you can imagine how that makes him feel about himself, where he can't do all those things, and you know, how he has to rely on her to do all those things, and then he has to ask her to do all those things, and it sort of makes him almost like a third child. They've got 2 kids, and it sort of makes him in some ways like a third child in that family, because they're all relying on the mother to do all these things, you know, and what he can actually contribute to the relationship is limited to earning some money and doing stuff around the house and that sort of thing. So you can imagine how that affects the dynamic of the relationship, and also how he feels about himself, you know. And this is often the case this is one example of why sometimes foreigners end up, they can't handle it, and they want to go back to their own country. And even if you're not married to a Japanese person and you're just living as a single person in an apartment, you can get the same feeling about this. Is that, you know, in your own country you can do all sorts of things and you're really competent, you can do all sorts of things, whereas in Japan, unless your Japanese skills are really good, you're going to be limited. And then the next level, so that guy's English Japanese skills are pretty low, so you know he can't really do anything. But even if your Japanese skills are really good and you can communicate, you can answer the phone, you can talk to people that come to the door, you can meet the teacher and talk to the teacher, and you can do all that sort of thing, and you can read the menu. You know, that guy, when he goes to the restaurant with his wife, she has to order for the kids, and she also has to order for him because he can't read the menu either. But let's assume you can, so you can answer the phone, you can answer the door, you can talk to the teachers, the teachers at the school, you can talk to the neighbours about all the local association stuff. You can read the menu in the restaurant, but you're still going to have things come up. You know, you're going to want to go to the bank and do something at the bank. You want to get a loan, or you want to do something at the bank, and they're going to give you documents. Or, you know, you go to the accountant gives you documents, or the mail turns up. You know, even if you can read Japanese, you know, a lot of people study Japanese. I know one guy who studied Japanese at university, or Asian studies, but Japanese was the language he studied, and his reading ability was pretty good. But when mail turned up, he still had to get his wife to read it often. I mean, sometimes not, of course, because you can just see what it is. But often, you know, you get these sort of letters from the city hall, or from the insurance company, or from, you know, somebody turns up with a really technical looking letter. And even if your reading skills are really good, there's still going to be stuff in there you don't know. Kanji's crazy, you know. Japanese people say all the time, don't know how many times over the years I've said to a Japanese person, I don't know this kanji, what's this kanji? And they look at it and they go, I don't know. That happens a lot. I've been with groups of people where there's something written on a wall and everybody stands there and looks at it, and they all ask each other, what's that say? I don't know. It might be stylized, or it might be old kanji or something, you know, but everybody stands there and looks at it. Is it this? Oh, I don't think it's that. And the big discussion about what it means. So, you know, reading Japanese in particular is really complex. And then even if you can read, how good's your writing skills in Japanese? And again, if you've got to complete home loan documents, or accounting documents, or, you know, documents for the kids' school, or, you know, some sort of special insurance documents, or some sort of special documents, if you can't do it, you've got to ask your partner to do it, you know. And again, at the beginning of a relationship, when you're just sort of getting together and that sort of thing, this sort of thing is not important. But when you're in a long-term relationship and you're married to somebody, and this sort of stuff keeps happening, you can imagine how this could affect the dynamic, you know. And you really need both people to accept that this is just the case. And if you have a problem with this, you're going to have a problem with this forever. You're going to need to deal with it, you know. And the partner's the same. If they have a problem with it, and you can imagine how the dynamic works then, because you imagine that this extends on to in-laws and things like that as well. And that's another thing, the language thing. That's another problem, of course, too. The language thing. You know, that guy I was talking about before, he can't communicate with his in-laws at all. And, you know, in-laws, as we mentioned in the previous video, often in-laws play a big part in people's lives here. If you can't communicate with the in-laws, actually it's the same guy I mentioned in that in-laws video who lived with them for a while, and it failed, and he ended up moving out. And someone asked later how that ended up. Someone left a comment and said, you never said how that ended. It ended in divorce. He ended up moving out. He was living with his family, with his wife and child in the in-laws house, and it just didn't work, and he just ended up moving out and living in his car for a while, and then he found another place to live and went and lived somewhere else, and they ended up getting divorced. And, you know, it wasn't because of the in-laws, it was, you know, for all the other reasons we've talked about in the previous videos, really. But the in-laws thing plays a big part in it, you know. If you have to spend time with these guys on a regular basis and you can't communicate with them, you know, we'll often, with our in-laws, we'll often sit around, or my in-laws, we'll often sit around all day. And, you know, things like New Year and Obon's coming up next week, and we've got all sorts of kids' birthdays and different events where you know, you'll go around there at 10 o'clock in the morning and stay there till 7 o'clock at night, and you're sitting there in a small room around a low table all day. And you know, if your Japanese skills are up to it, you can keep up. You'll get tired. It's tiring. It definitely is tiring. It is tiring trying to pay attention to everything that's going on, listen to everything that's going on. It is tiring, but you can get through it, you know, if your Japanese is up to it. If your Japanese is not up to it, that's going to be a really long 9 hours just sitting there at the table, not being able to talk to anybody, you know. So, or probably translation. And see, here's the other thing. Again, in our family, it's all Japanese, you know. But in the usual case, the foreigner, the Japanese person speaks English, and then when you're at the in-laws, your Japanese partner's translating for you all the time. You know, about maybe about the important things. Maybe you can get by on the simple things, but if your Japanese isn't up to it, to be able to stay part of the conversation about what they're going to do next week on the Saturday and what you think about it, if you can't keep up with all that, your partner's got to sit there and keep translating for you. So, you know, if everybody's well-balanced, happy individual with no issues at all and no problems at all, you can get through this, you know. You can get through it. People get through it. But you can imagine it's inevitable. It's sort of like trying to try to get this to work with everybody and get everybody to be cool with this, because it's not just you and your partner. It tends to be all sorts of people are affected by this. And it just, if nothing else, it just adds up. I mean, a lot of these videos about this particular topic, about being married to a Japanese person, a lot of these points individually might not seem like a big deal, but when you add them all up, it's like the how-to playlist in general. You know, quite often on the how-to videos, people listen to them and say, oh, that's not a big deal, I can handle that. Taking my shoes off to go inside a building, or, you know, not being able to do that, or having to do that, or having to wear toilet slippers all the time, or, you know, all the different little things. But, oh, that's no big deal. But what tends to happen is these things tend to be cumulative. And that's why if you sit down in Japan with another foreigner who's been here long term, and you know, nothing funnier than 3 or 4 foreigners who've lived here long term sitting around a table. That's why the Cool Japan TV program at NHK don't allow anyone on the program that's been in Japan for longer than a year. Because the people who've been here under a year, all this stuff's not a big deal. It's no big deal. And they're all focused on all the good stuff. How wonderful. And we get this on these how-to videos too. One guy left a message recently and said, I lived in Japan and I didn't see this at all. I didn't see this at all. How long did you live in Japan for? 8 months. Oh, well, that's a visit, really. It's not really living in Japan, really, is it? For 8 months, it's a visit. And of course, you know, 8 months. You can easily live in Japan, and particularly the way a lot of people live here, they'll come here and work for a company where they're put in an apartment building with a bunch of other foreigners. So they're surrounded by other foreigners all day, every day, and then they go to work where they're surrounded by foreigners all day, every day. If they work for an English school, they're speaking English all day, every day, to other foreigners all day, every day. Yeah, of course, you can not experience any of this nonsense if you're living like that. But, you know, when you're living here for years, year after year after year, and you're living in a place where you're the only foreigner and you're living the Japanese life. You're living in a house, you've got a Japanese wife and kids, and they're going to a Japanese school, and you're doing the thing, and it's the real thing, and that's where these things add up, and that's usually what happens is, you know, that initial... I mean, Japan's a wonderful place to live, and people live here forever, permanently, really permanently, not 8 months, but permanently. There's a reason for that. It's because it is a wonderful place to live, but it's not all that stars in your eyes stuff that people get excited about. It's the day-to-day stuff that is the reason to live here. It's because it's clean, and it's civilized, and it's peaceful, and it's harmonious, and it's a good place to live for all the practical reasons. It's a good place to live, and that's why people live here. But you know, it has to balance out, and for a lot of people, it just doesn't. You know, they on one side of the scale, you've got those things that are said about what a nice place it is to live, and the peacefulness and the harmony and the no violence and the no aggression. No aggression is wonderful, and all these things on the positive side of the scale. And on the other side of the scale, You know, people are missing their home country, they're missing their home culture, their home food, their home family, their family. They're missing their family, they're missing their friends that they grew up with. They're missing feeling normal. You know, feeling normal in their home country, where they're considered to be a normal person and not considered to be an alien. You know, and then all the things on the how-to list that they have to do here in Japan, if they go back to their own country, they don't have to do all that stuff. So, you know, this is what usually happens in the majority of cases, is that over the years that scale gets tilted. At first it's like, oh, I want to live in Japan forever. You know, there's a guy in particular that used to live in Kyoto, and he used to talk like that all the time. He was staying in Japan forever. He was an Aussie too. I'm never going back to Australia. He used to say, I'm never going back to Australia. I'm staying there forever. I love this place. And he'd talk to you for hours about how great Japan is. And then slowly over time, you could see in his mind that the scale started to go the other way. And that slowly his conversations became less positive, and he just started to get more and more frustrated with the place, and he's gone, he's back in Australia. And that's what happens. And the problem is that if you're a single person, that's no big deal, right? You can decide, you say you want to live here forever, you can change your mind, pack your bags, go back to your own country and stay there. No big deal. But if you've got married, it's going to obviously make it that much more complicated. And then probably we're going to address, people keep asking about kids. Well, you know, if that marriage has involved children as well, that's going to take the complication to a huge level. A huge level that only people that have had kids would understand. You know, and we're sort of probably going to have to talk about that. People keep asking about that one. Are you going to talk about what it's like raising kids in Japan? Yeah, probably, because that's huge. And that makes all this more serious. You know, the how-to playlist, you know, if you're not here long term, or if you're free to leave any time, the how-to stuff's not really a big deal. But once you get married, it takes it to a whole more serious level, you know. And then if you have kids, of course, that kicks it up to a ridiculously serious level. So again, the language thing, which was the topic, you might remember, that was actually the topic of the video, was the language thing. Yeah, it really complicates things. So what can you do? I mean, just be aware of it. Ideally, come to Japan with perfect Japanese would be ideal. But you know, if nothing else, just at least be aware of this fact that you know, if you find yourself in a relationship with a Japanese person and their English is really weak, and one final piece of advice: if you do find yourself in that circumstance where their English is really weak and your Japanese is weak, one piece of advice would be use Japanese if you're living in Japan, because if you're living in Japan, it's going to be more important that your Japanese improves than their English. And they might want to do English in the house, and it might be easier for you to do English in the house. Don't do it. Don't do it, because it's really important that you improve your Japanese skills for all the reasons that were just mentioned in this video. You know, it's not just for your relationship with them directly, but also with everything around you. So this is really important, and that's why we had in our house, we had a policy right from the start that, you know, my wife can't speak English, so we just never did, and never got into it, and just never did it. Just concentrated on improving my Japanese instead, and that's a really important thing. And since then, that's been years and years. But since then, I've heard so many examples of people trying the other way, like the guy I said, who he just surrounded himself by people who could speak English, and a lot of foreigners do that. Rather than them improving their Japanese, they just choose to only hang out with people who can speak English, and that makes it easier short term. But it's not really a long-term solution, is it, as you can imagine? So that would be one piece of advice, definitely, would be if you do end up with in a relationship with a Japanese person in Japan, stick to Japanese. They might want to practice English because it's fun for them, but really focus on the Japanese and stick to the Japanese and work on improving that. Because that's about the best thing you could do for a long-term sort of thing, you know. So anyway, there it was. Hopefully someone found that helpful in some small way. More videos coming soon.